Hello, this is Dr. Grande. Today I will analyze the case of Richard Seith. First I'll look at the background of this case, move to the timeline of the crime, then offer my analysis. Richard Edmund Seith was born on November 2, 1971, and eventually lived in Jensen Beach, Florida. This is 89 miles north of Fort Lauderdale. In 1994, he graduated with a bachelor's degree from a college in New York. In the year 2000, he completed medical school. A few years later, Richard worked as an ophthalmologist in both Martin and St. Lucie counties in the state of Florida. He lived in a 2,000-square-foot, three-bedroom house in Jensen Beach. Richard married a woman who was also an ophthalmologist. They had a child sometime around 2009. In 2012, he joined the Treasure Coast Eye Specialists on Ocean Boulevard in nearby Stuart, Florida. Richard divorced in 2013. In 2018, he married a woman named Cynthia, who went by the name Cindy. She worked in the ophthalmology practice, but she was not an ophthalmologist. Throughout the course of the relationship, Richard allegedly pressured Cindy to function as a swinger. Cindy became unhappy with this arrangement and stopped engaging in swinging activity toward the end of 2022. She decided that she wanted to gain financial independence from Richard. In order to achieve this goal, she found work as a flight attendant with Spirit Airlines. In 2023, Cindy moved to Houston, Texas, and lived with her adult son. She filed for divorce in January 2024 and moved back to Florida. She lived in a condominium in Lake Worth, which was owned by Richard. Sometimes Cindy stayed with a friend of hers who lived in a house on Southeast Riverside Terrace in Stuart. The police have referred to this friend as Miss Rizzo. Richard would frequently drive by this house in his orange Jeep Wrangler. On July 10, 2024, at 7:18 p.m., Miss Rizzo contacted the police and said that one of her bedroom windows had been shattered by gunfire. The police found a hole in the window blinds and a bullet stuck in the drywall of a closet. They also found that a work truck parked in front of the residence had been struck by a bullet. Miss Rizzo told the police that Richard may have been the shooter. He had been watching her residence, driving by, checking on his wife Cindy. As an officer was getting ready to leave after taking a report, he saw Richard driving his orange Jeep Wrangler in the neighborhood. He pulled Richard over and asked him if he had a firearm. Richard said that he had a 9mm Glock pistol in the center console. The officer asked him if he had fired the weapon into a house. Richard denied involvement in the shooting incident, but admitted that he had been driving by the house of Miss Rizzo on a regular basis. He explained that he was in a dispute with his wife in court about her living in his Lake Worth condominium. Cindy claimed that she needed it, but then spent most of her time at the house of Miss Rizzo. Richard was hoping to use this information in court proceedings. The officer removed the pistol from the Jeep Wrangler. It was later determined that the weapon used to shoot Miss Rizzo's house was not a 9mm. No charges were filed against Richard. The next day, Miss Rizzo filed for a restraining order against Richard, but it was denied. 13 days later, she filed for a second time. This was also denied. Almost a year later, in May 2025, the divorce between Richard and Cindy was finalized. Now moving to the timeline of the crime. On July 15, 2025, at 3:22 a.m., the police received a man-down call request from firefighters after they located a woman on a sidewalk with an apparent gunshot wound. She was pronounced dead at 3:26 a.m. The woman was later identified as Richard's ex-wife, Cindy. Here is what the police found during the course of their investigation. Cindy was face down on the sidewalk on the west side of Lucerne Lakes Boulevard, 75 feet from the condominium where she lived. She had been shot one time in the head. Cindy was wearing a flight attendant uniform. Her cell phone was next to her body, and her car keys were in her hand. 10 feet away, there was a suitcase which belonged to Cindy. Her gray 2016 Subaru was in a nearby parking space. No firearm was discovered at the scene. The police believe that Cindy had just arrived home from work when she was ambushed. Richard Seith was the obvious suspect in the case. He had divorced from Cindy 2 months earlier. The court ordered Richard to pay Cindy $250,000 plus another $35,000 to pay off the condominium in Lake Worth. On 2 occasions, Cindy had reported vandalism to her vehicle, she believed that her ex-husband, Richard, was responsible. The police spoke to a witness who saw Cindy arrive home on July 14 at 11:43 p.m. There was a motion-activated dashboard camera inside Cindy's vehicle. The video indicated that Cindy was shot 4 minutes later at 11:47 p.m. At the moment she was shot, the killer was standing outside the frame of the camera. A few seconds later, a man wearing a baseball cap, presumably the killer, could be seen bending down behind Cindy's vehicle. When the police examined the vehicle, they found smudges on the undercarriage, and there was a spot where there was no dirt, as if something had been attached to the vehicle, maybe something like a GPS unit. Perhaps that is why the killer had bent down behind the vehicle to remove the GPS. Using data from license plate readers, the police tracked the movement of Richard's orange Jeep Wrangler. On July 14, at 11:18 p.m., about a half hour before the shooting, the Wrangler was captured driving west on Lake Worth Road. At 11:22 p.m., the Wrangler was captured inside Cindy's neighborhood. At 11:55 p.m., 8 minutes after the shooting, the Wrangler was captured about 0.8 miles from the scene of the murder driving away. It was captured several more times after this, continuing to drive away from the scene. On July 16, 2025, the police interviewed Richard Seith at the Palm Beach County Sheriff's Office. He said that the last time he had been in Palm Beach County was for a concert on July 5. The last time he saw Cindy in person was at a court hearing in December 2024. He denied any involvement in Cindy's death. While the interview was taking place, the police searched Richard's house and found a Cube GPS Pro tracking device. He had purchased this in May 2025 from Amazon, so he purchased it during the same month that his divorce finalized. He canceled his subscription to the tracking service on July 15 at 3:02 a.m., 3 hours and 15 minutes after Cindy was murdered. On July 18, 2025, Richard Seith was arrested at his home in Jensen Beach. He was charged with first-degree murder with a firearm. At the time I'm making this video, Richard is working his way through the criminal justice system. Now moving to my analysis. Richard Seith maintains his innocence, although it's not clear if he has any supporters. If he did have supporters, they would argue that there just isn't enough evidence to convict him. The state of Florida, of course, would disagree. They believe it's pretty obvious who murdered Richard's ex-wife, Cindy. This brings me to the question, was Richard Seith guilty of murder? Let's take a look at the evidence both for and against the idea that he was guilty, starting with the inculpatory factors. In the years leading up to the termination of Richard's marriage, he and his wife appeared to have different expectations about their sexual activity. They had been functioning as swingers, allegedly because Richard was coercing Cindy into this behavior. Eventually, Cindy grew tired of this and stopped being a swinger. An acquaintance of Cindy told the police that when she went to flight attendant training, Richard said he could not drink alcohol when home alone because his mind would go to a dark place. He was imagining what Cindy was doing while she was away from him. This makes Richard sound jealous and controlling. Richard allegedly confessed to Cindy that he stalked a former girlfriend using a fake profile on Facebook, and allegedly told an acquaintance that he considered killing his first wife after they divorced. A year before the murder, someone fired through a window of a house where Cindy was known to stay. Richard was caught driving in the area right after this happened. 2 months before the murder, the divorce between Richard and Cindy was finalized. He was ordered to pay her $285,000. Richard claimed that he didn't buy Cindy's story about her needing to live in his condominium. There may have been some hard feelings there. Richard's cell phone connected with towers near the scene of the murder from 11:22 p.m. to 11:53 p.m. Again, the shooting took place at 11:47 p.m. License plate readers captured Richard's Jeep Wrangler driving toward the condominium where Cindy lived before the murder and driving away from it after the murder. Richard lied when he said the last time he was in Palm Beach County was on July 5. A person was captured by Cindy's dashboard camera bending down behind her vehicle right after the shooting. The undercarriage of the vehicle had markings consistent with somebody removing a small device which had been attached to the vehicle. Inside Richard's house, the police found a GPS unit. he canceled the service for the GPS right after the murder. On July 14, 2025, which was the night of the murder, someone had used Richard's cell phone to search for Fort Lauderdale Airport. Furthermore, someone used the phone to visit a website that tracks flights and clicked on a link for Spirit Airlines. This looks bad for Richard because Cindy worked for Spirit Airlines as a flight attendant and was killed right after coming home from that job. On July 15, at 1:12 a.m., about 1.5 hours after the murder, the security system at Richard's ophthalmology practice was disarmed using his code. The system was rearmed at 2:10 a.m. When the police searched his practice, they found firearms and ammunition. Why would Richard have visited his office at night, and why would he store weapons there? In Richard's Jeep Wrangler, the police found a 9mm Glock pistol, which appeared to have been recently cleaned. Moving to the exculpatory factors, there were no witnesses to the murder, and Cindy's dashboard camera did not capture the shooting. It did capture a person bending down behind Cindy's vehicle right after the murder, who was probably the shooter, but that person could not be identified as Richard. Technically, any number of people could have murdered Cindy. Just because Richard's vehicle was in the area doesn't mean he was the killer. That's pretty much it for the exculpatory factors. When considering all the evidence in this case, do I believe that Richard Seith was guilty of murder? Yes, in my opinion, he was guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. Canceling the GPS service right after the murder really damages Richard's case. That is very difficult to explain if he is innocent. What do I think happened in this case? This is just a theory, my opinion. Richard Seith was self-centered, impulsive, cold, callous, calculating, jealous, insecure, controlling, demanding, manipulative, deceptive, had a sense of entitlement, and was exceedingly creepy. Leading up to his divorce being finalized, Richard engaged in stalking behavior against Cindy. Up until the homicide, he mostly functioned as a resentful stalker. This type of stalker tries to intimidate and terrorize a former lover to regain power and control. Vandalizing property and harassing the victim's friends are common tactics. Cindy's vehicles were vandalized, and the house of Cindy's friend, Miss Rizzo, was shot. It was never proven that Richard was responsible for these events, but one could argue he was a pretty good potential suspect. Eventually, Richard morphed into a predatory stalker. He murdered Cindy not far from her condominium. Cindy was aware that Richard was dangerous, but she probably never imagined he would resort to homicide. If Richard is guilty, his background is very unusual for someone who engaged in stalking and then committed murder. He did not have many of the risk factors associated with homicidal stalking. For example, homicidal stalkers tend to be under the age of 30. Richard was 53 at the time of the murder. They usually have less than a high school education. Richard had a medical degree. And they often have cluster B personality pathology, that is, antisocial, narcissistic, borderline, or histrionic personality disorder. There is no record of Richard having any personality disorder. There were some other risk factors for homicidal stalking behavior that Richard did have. For example, he felt humiliated by a romantic interest and may have been angry at her. When looking at the totality of the situation, however, Richard's case is still very unusual. Professionals do not often become homicidal stalkers. People tend to believe that professionals are unlikely to be stalkers for a few reasons. For example, they earn a lot of money, which opens up alternative romantic possibilities, like it's easier for them to find a new partner after being rejected. They must be pretty stable emotionally to get through all that education and to work as a professional. And many professionals are in helping fields, which are highly pro-social. The case of Richard Seith demonstrates how everyone, regardless of their education and skill, can be brought down by powerful emotions. Now moving to my final thoughts. Who killed Cindy may not be a mystery, but there is one mysterious element in this case. If Richard is the one who shot Miss Rizzo's house, what did he do with the firearm that he used in the shooting, and why did he continue driving around the area? Richard's own statement to the police may reveal the answers. He told the officer who pulled him over that he worked nearby. I wonder if he put the gun in this office. He also mentioned that he had once been very close with the couple who lived in the house. Perhaps this was another instance of Richard giving in to his emotions. He just couldn't stay away. Despite being an ophthalmologist, Richard lost focus and failed to appreciate the dangers of tunnel vision. In the end, he was an atypical professional. There was more to him than met the eye. Those are my thoughts in the case of Richard Seith. Thank you so much for watching. I'll talk to you soon.